as the Swindler's Encouragement Committee. There was a point in time when I just thought this was one of Doug's clever turns of phrases. But what I've come to learn personally, being regulated by the SEC, is that people like myself who are in fact ethical and, when we understand the law, law-abiding, are easy targets. The will-o-wisp, the charlatan, the fraud, the people who are always on the move, the people who are dodgy, they're very tough targets. What regulator would want a tough target? Why don't you go after somebody who is well capitalized, who is a fixed target, and as a consequence, the efforts of the regulators are usually on what they perceive to be fixed, soft targets, not exactly the community that they were set up to go after. I had a visit, I do every 2 years, with the, I gotta say it correctly, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And it's an interesting process. They come in and you get an entrance interview and you get an exit interview. And in the entrance interview, the same thing happens, by the way, with the self-regulatory authority, the FINRA. In these interviews before the audit, you are allowed to tell them things about your business that you think they ought to know, that might help them with their audit. And at the end of the audit, you can question them about their results and about their practices. And they're very, very, very useful. It used to be, 20 years ago, that I avoided those entrance and exit interviews just because I was allergic to those people. But what I've learned is they are just people, and it's very, very, very useful. So in the entrance interview, I have taken to saying to the auditors, you know, one of the things that you need to know about our firm is we're required to have this much net capital, and we have this much net capital. That says two things for you, Mr. Regulator. In the first instance, it says to you that I'm not afraid of investor rescission suits. I'm not afraid of my own malfeasance. Otherwise, I would have stripped the cash out of my firm. The second thing it says to you is if I do go upside down, there's enough cash in there that it won't harm the industry particularly. That's very useful because what they're really looking for is not to make a mistake which would negatively influence their career. That's what they're really looking for. But a couple of years ago, I had more interesting things on my mind. And a regulator, by the way, very, very, very nice young guy comes in, we're talking, and I said, listen, I want to make sure I have this right, and so you've got to help me. An audit, in an audit of a securities firm, what you do is you look at my trade blotter. That's where you recognize every transaction that you did. And you look for evidence of the transactions by taking trade tickets. Maybe you take 20 or 30 of them, and you call the counterparties to make sure the trade's happened. On the other hand, you take the check registers. You see the payment that you received for the sales that you made, the checks that you wrote for the purchases that you made. And that's the basis of the audit. And of course, immediately the guy says, oh, well, no, we checked this and this and this and this. Right. I know you do all that. But really what you do is you want to make sure that we did what we said we were going to do, right? You just, okay, right. Okay, here's my question. You guys, because you're supposed to check all of us once every 2 years, had to do 8 audits on Bernie Madoff. 8 times you had to check his trade blotter. You had to pull his trade tickets, and you had to check his check register. And you had to call those guys for the counterparties. And he didn't make any trades. So, I'm not a securities regulator. I mean, I'm a credit analyst. I'm a Shylock. I could have busted him. How is it that he got through 8 audits with you, he never made a trade, and you pulled and called trade records, and you pulled and called checks? How did that work? What kind of audit was that? Response was interesting. Mr. Rule, the Los Angeles Bureau has been curious about that too. True story. True story. This is the protection that you're offered up. The response, of course, to this failing by the SEC and by FINRA was the suggestion that they were overworked and needed a larger budget. The fact that somehow they attended to 8 audits, or they didn't, only one or the other can be true. I mean, they either went there, or they didn't go there. Those are the only 2 choices. Neither of them good. Because his was a much bigger firm than mine. If they managed to come see me, they should have managed to go see him. He was certain, I mean, Madoff was certainly more important than Rule, especially the aftermath. Would suggest that the suggestion that this agency offers up protection from fraud is in fact fraud. Another thing I'd like to leave with you is Enron. Enron was a situation where for years they were a registrant. For years they filed a plethora of reporting documents, probably this high, and I don't know how high they were, but there was lots of them. And they were filed according to the rules made for and provided by in statute for years and years and years and years and years. It turns out, arguably, that they perpetrated fraud. As a consequence of that fraud, and by the way, anybody here, you're a lawyer, right? Was fraud illegal before Enron? That's what I thought. I wasn't sure, I'm not a lawyer. But I sort of remember, in the dim, distant recesses of my memory, that fraud was already legal. As a consequence of this failing by the regulator, by the protector, to catch the fraud perpetrated by Enron, what did Congress do? They increased the SEC's budget, and they passed something called Sarbanes-Oxley. Now we're going to get into the economics of protection. The judge in the Enron case estimated in sentencing that the Enron fraud cost American investors $70 billion. That noted libertarian, social conservative, Warren Buffett, has estimated that Sarbanes-Oxley costs American shareholders $100 billion a year. So a regulatory failing, not a market failing, a regulatory failing that costs taxpayers $70 billion a year has been institutionalized into a set of absolutely useless regulations that will not, by the way, protect anybody from fraud, that costs us $100 billion annually. Yet, when I come to gatherings, even gatherings like these, there are people who believe that they don't need to read the regulatory filings themselves as a consequence of the fact that there are lots of regulators in an over-regulated business that will protect them. In fact, you do need to read the filings, and you need to read them knowing full well that there are a lot of people out there who will lie in the filings. You yourself need to assume that there will be another Madoff, that there will be another Enron. I don't need to name the malcreants here in town. You're familiar with them. You know them. They exist in a regulatory environment, and the population of miscreants and malcreants in this regulated environment, this city, are legend. And the notion that the British Columbia Securities Commission or the Ontario Securities Commission, the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or any of these other people are going to do anything that would cause you to discharge your own personal responsibility to understand, first of all, the person you invest with, if it's somebody like me, or the company, is complete nonsense. And yet we do it. On a bigger scale, and this will be, I guess, a little bit philosophical, it was touched on by Steph, and I thought it was brilliant. The immorality of suggesting to society at large that they are protected by the SEC or by Social Security or by any of this system that would appear to anybody who didn't flunk third grade math that they're going to go broke it's crazy. I talk to so many investors who believe the promises that have been made in the context of the SEC, in the context of Social Security. I run into a whole different class of investors who, as a consequence of government action since the 2008 psychotic break in the credit markets, believe that the political response to that crisis in terms of the government participation in the economy was in the first instance desirable and in the second instance sustainable. And I want to talk about that response, and I want to talk about that response in the context of what you do with your money now. Does anybody in the room believe, for yourself, that any of the causes precedent to the 2008 market collapse, does anybody here believe that they've been addressed in any way, shape, or form? By the way, you can raise your hand if you want to argue with me. I'm just curious if anybody in the room believes that the set of circumstances that gave rise to the 2008 collapse has been addressed. Nobody, right? What they did, from their point of view, was pretty intelligent. People were terrified, and so there was a credit contraction.